Welcome to Advancing Accessibility, a mini podcast series focusing on the great work done by individuals pushing for accessibility in the gaming industry and answering the question, what's next? This show is brought to you by Player Research's Advancing Accessibility. To find out more about what Player Research and this initiative, you can go to the link in the show notes or to playerresearch.com. I'm Steve Saylor, an accessibility consultant, content creator, Twitch ambassador, and host of this series. And today's episode is all about making accessibility accessible. My guest today is game accessibility lead at Player Research, Améliane Chiasson, and also just, a great human being and friend. Hi, Ame. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. Hey, we're starting off this series, and I'm excited to talk to some of the guests that we have lined up. So this is going to be a good show. For those who may not know a little bit about kind of what this show is going to be about, why don't you kind of explain a little bit from Player Research's end, like what is this Advancing Accessibility show?
Yeah, so basically, to give it a little bit of context, so last year in 2023, so right now we're in the summer of 2024, last year in 2023, we launched a suite of services called Advancing Accessibility. And as part of those services, we have different offerings that go from user research to accessibility QA, consultancy, things like that. And something that is really important to me as well is that two things. We work with people with disabilities in the accessibility community and the disability and gaming community that we research with players who have accessibility needs, and also that we empower the voices of people who work in the space and who advocate for accessibility in gaming. And so, this podcast was a bit of an effort to that as well, to highlight the work of amazing folks in the community across different sort of fields in accessibility on the development side, on the advocacy side, on the gaming side, and to sort of show people what wonderful people are doing to advance accessibility in gaming. And actually having you as a host was a great option as well, because I'm aware that you are a great radio voice and a great streamer and content creator, and I thought who better to host this podcast series than Steve Saylor, because you're used to this. I'm not. So I figured it'll be way better if you do it than if I do.
It's okay. I always say it's like I got a face for podcasting, so it's fine. So before we get into the actual kind of like the nitty gritty of what we're talking about today, and then also what the future of this little mini series is going to be, what we're going to look into, and the different types of topics we're going to talk about, I'd love to be able to kind of start the conversation off with getting to know a little bit more about the guest. You're going to find out that we'll get to a little bit kind of like the beginnings of some of our favorite people in the accessibility space. So first question I have for you, Ame, is why don't you tell us what got you interested in gaming? What was that sort of initial spark when you found out gaming for the first time?
So contrary, I think, to some people, my first introduction to gaming was through my mother. My mom was a huge nerd, kind of still is. And back in the day, she was playing on the NES. That was my first introduction to it. And she was playing Metroid and different Mario games and like Duck Hunt and like things like that. And at first I was not playing at all. I was pretty small. But eventually what happened is that when my mom would go away to work, because for those who are younger now, we used to stay home alone like a lot, even though we were way too young to stay home alone. I feel
were
like
you a latchkey kid too?
Yeah, it's kind of a thing of like, you come back to work alone. I'm like 6 years old, and it's kind of what it used to be.
I know. I didn't have that until I was at least 13. So
really?
You got a few years jump on me on that one.
Yeah. I would, so my mom would come back from work, pretty late at night. And so I had to kind of like entertain myself at home. But the thing is that back in the day, my mother told me that video games were not for children. And so
interesting.
And I learned later on that she did that because she was afraid that it would mess up her save files.
I love
So
that so much. It's like, nah. Video games are not for you.
yeah,
Just
so
don't
she
touch
would
my
like,
save files.
so she would lock them away. But of course, kids were ingenious, and so I found
Yeah.
ways to play. And yeah, I think one of the first games I ever played was The Legend of Zelda. That
Oh,
I first like saw, but like I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just throwing pots around and just not really understanding what was going on.
yeah.
And yeah, and it kind of went from there. And I think most of my childhood I mostly played on handheld consoles, so
Oh,
like the Game Boy
yeah.
Advance. Played a lot on the Game Boy Advance for a long time, and then slowly but surely sort of transitioned to PC gaming at my dad's house, because that's where we had the family PC in the kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I started playing Diablo on there, as well as Age of Empire. So yeah, it kind of always stayed in my life. By the way, my cat is probably, for those who are watching the video, my cat is gonna probably walk around, make my desk shake. But
It's fine.
for those who are just listening, you will not experience this, but but she's here.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's pretty much been my introduction to gaming, and it really stayed throughout my life. Gaming has always been this kind of consistent hobby and passion that's never really went away.
Okay, well, I love that. So, when you kind of were like you said, you had your Game Boy was kind of like the sort of your kind of main console that was kind of just yours. Do you remember when you like what was sort of like when you finally had enough, like either saved up for allowance or you had enough money to be able to buy a game for the first time? Do you remember what game that was, and do you remember why
Yes.
you wanted to get it?
Yes, I remember. So the first game I bought myself
Yeah.
was a game on the Game Boy Advance called The Sims. It was Sims the Herbs, Sims in the City.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
So this game I played a lot, and I like to call it my first RPG game.
Nice.
Because it kind of is like this
Yeah.
game. If you've played, I don't know if you played it, but it was a pretty long game, and you had different types of characters that you could build, and you could build like reputation in different like groups in the city, and you had to like gather resources and money, and like you had to build your own apartment and go through like missions and quests from like different people around the city. So like to me, this was like an open world RPG. Okay.
Yeah.
And and yeah, this is the first game I bought with my own money. Yeah, and I bought it secondhand at like a pawn shop. So
Oh, you did. Oh, okay.
yeah, so it was
Okay.
pretty cheap. And yeah, I played a lot of this game.
I think mine was I'm trying to remember back. It was either one of these two. It was either the Matrix Online or it was Star Trek Voyager Elite Force. I was a big Star Trek kid, so
Nice.
I played a ton of Star Trek and Star Wars games growing up. And I remember I was like, "Oh, Star Trek, and it's a first-person shooter. I want to play that." And it just happened to be it was on PC, and so I remember that was like the first kind of. I think it was either that, yeah, or Matrix Online was like the first game I actually like spent hard-earned money to be able to get. So although I was like, I did wish I had a Game Boy also growing up. That was the one thing that my friends had all had. They had some version of a Game Boy, whether it was just the original or Game Boy Color or even Game Boy Advance. And I never really, the only Game Boy I had was a Game Boy Advance SP as a teenager. But by that point, I was kind of like not really get into games that much. I wasn't playing a lot of them. But I remember just like still sitting in my living room in the dark with my parents were watching TV, and I would just sit and play Tetris pretty much the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a classic.
Exactly.
What was your go-to platform prior to that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think because I was able to play because with the Game Boy Advance you were able to play like older Game Boy games. So it was because I think the cartridge I had was the original from the original Game Boy because it was on sale or something like that, or I bought it off of like a it was a rental that I bought, whatever. But yeah, it was that was like my first sort of foray into like very addictive kind of gaming on the Game Boy. But
yeah, that was cool with the Game Boy Advance. I remember we could just put the old cartridges into it and it would work. That was awesome.
I know, backwards compatibility. Who knew that would be a thing that we would still want today that we wish we could have. But anyway.
It's kind of starting to be like more of a standard now, I feel, but we had a couple of years in there that were kind of annoying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we're all for video game preservation around here. I would
Yeah.
love to, go back and play old games for sure. So while you were kind of like getting into gaming, or yourself, kind of growing up, what sort of what interested you, or what was the thing that made you decide, oh, I can actually be able to work in the gaming space?
So that's a funny thing because when I was little and like as a teenager and stuff, I feel like I changed my mind every week about what I wanted to do as a grown up.
Sure.
I wanted to be a veterinarian, like a lot of people, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I wanted to be a teacher. Basically, when I went into my teenage years is when, I started to really, really sort of get into gaming more seriously, if that makes sense. I would play like hours on end with like my friends, Diablo or like The Sims. I played like a whole bunch of The Sims as well, and I wanted to be a game designer. That was kind of
Hmm.
like what I wanted to do, but sort of life took me to another path. I left home very young and had to sort of like survive and fend for myself in this
Sure.
harsh world. And I sort of had given up that dream for a couple of years until I want to say 2013 when I joined the games industry as a game tester.
Hmm.
So prior to that, I was just working, odd jobs in like, retail or sales or like whatever. Like I did everything you can think of, I did it almost. And so I joined as a QA tester at Eidos Montreal. Shout out. And yeah, and I sort of never left the industry since then. So this has been over 10 years now that I've been in this industry, and I would not change nothing
So,
from this journey. This was where I grew up. I grew up with this industry. I grew up as a person and as a professional.
wow. So wait, you've when you started working in the industry, you were like in Montreal, and you've basically been in, like, you've never left Montreal to like with all the different places that you worked in the industry.
No, I've always stayed in Montreal.
Oh wow, I did not
And
know that.
like,
Huh.
yeah, I've always stayed in Montreal. I basically sort of grew from within this industry. I never went to university.
Uh huh.
And so, this is something that sometimes people tend to not talk about because, they might feel like, oh, I don't have as much education as like others and stuff. But I feel like
Right.
what's really great about this industry, though, is that, you know, there's people who come from all walks of life, and
Hmm.
that includes a lot of the guests on the podcast actually,
Yeah.
who have all different types of backgrounds and ended up in this industry in different ways. And so yeah, this is what I love about this industry. We have people with such a diverse background of personal and professional experiences, and that's definitely my case as well. And so yeah, and then yeah, QA. Then I worked in user research for a couple of years, and eventually found my way to accessibility.
I was about to say, so like with the because like for those who may not know, kind of like jumping from like QA to user research, it's not that much of a hop towards accessibility in that sense. That's kind of where a lot of us sort of start, is usually in that kind of field. So question I have is sort of, what was it that interested you in accessibility as like, okay, yeah, this is the field that I want to continue focusing on in the industry?
So it's always an interesting question that I get asked because I feel like I always have a different answer because I think it's a lot of different things that sort of ended up sort of coming together as like, okay, I need to do this. I can't pinpoint like a single moment that made me go like, I want to work in accessibility. I think
Mm,
what happened is that over the course of multiple years, there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, which kind of exposed me to a lot of the struggles that I felt. Something was wrong with me. Like I didn't know what was going on with me. And eventually, like, it was like, oh, like, I was able to finally have an answer for a lot of my patterns of behavior, including
mm,
in gaming. Like I was struggling a lot in gaming because I enjoyed gaming, but I never was able to finish any game. Like I was, hopping from one game to the other, and also getting very frustrated with some video games that I felt very overwhelmed in. And so that's one thing. then playing with friends who had disabilities, also being exposed to sort of like, oh, like we can do the same stuff, which sucks, like I wish we could just play together and not really encounter any barriers. So I felt bad for some of my friends who were like sort of had to be left on the side because they were not able to like join us into some games that we played.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, also in user research especially, we work with participants, players from different player profiles, and was exposed to a lot of different people who had varying levels of needs related to accessibility, whether it was visual needs or people who played with like a custom adaptive setup for their controller, different things like that. And so kind of being impressed both by the ingenuity and like resourcefulness of the disability community, I was also angry at the industry for not facilitating those experiences
Mm-hmm.
better. And so it started with just me sort of educating myself and doing like in studio like social events or like talks or like things like that with different speakers and advocates, and like doing these sort of meetups at the studio, and it eventually evolved into something kind of more full time, because at some point I was like, okay, I'm kind of doing two jobs right now. and so
Yeah.
and so we actually founded the accessibility department back when I was at IDOS Montreal for Square Enix.
Very cool. Well, like, I love that you kind of said that essentially how a lot of us kind of get into the accessibility space. It's sort of, it's just exposure and then anger.
Yeah.
It's just, you get exposure. It's like, oh, you can't do this. Oh, that makes, I want to do something about it. And it just, that's kind of the same for, I think a lot of us in the space, which is, hey, at least there's a bit of common ground there for a lot of us. So let's kind of go into a little bit like, just for like a little bit kind of like an accessibility 101, just for those who are jumping into this and either finding it through myself or through player research, or just people want to be able to know a little bit more about accessibility. Why don't you start off with like, what is accessibility and how does it like relate to gaming? And like let's talk about like some definitions for people who may not be, or maybe hearing about it for the first time.
Yeah, so accessibility, and I'll start with like the very generic sort of description, and then we can go into like how it relates to gaming.
Yeah.
So accessibility, at least how I describe it, I think in a simple way for people, is the breadth of people being able to experience a product or service or an experience in a comfortable and enjoyable way. And I like to say enjoyable as well, because sometimes people tend to kind of think that accessibility is just about accessing the thing, but not necessarily having a good time using the thing.
Sure.
I really believe in, accessibility also, pushing it to the point where it's like, no, you're actually enjoying yourself, doing this thing, as would anyone else. And so that's kind of like how I describe it in the most simplest way possible. An accessibility barrier would be, an obstacle that you meet or that you face when going through either a game, in our case, or it can also be in the physical environment or whatever it is, that actually prevents you either from progressing or progressing comfortably forward or in an enjoyable manner. And so that's how I describe accessibility just in general. And how it relates to gaming, well, just like in movies or other entertainment industries, gaming is something that people do to either enjoy escapism or have fun or play with their friends or have a some relaxing time or challenging times, or we all have different reasons for why we're gonna pick up a controller and start playing something. But the unfortunate things is that a lot of people still to this day cannot just do that, because they can either not even access the game to begin with due to accessibility barriers, or they cannot do it independently and need either support from their friends or family. And so, you kind of remove a lot of that player agency from a lot of people who are trying to just have fun and just take a break from life.
I love that definition, because it kind of does sort of show that, you know, it is, yes, for those with disabilities, but it can also benefit other people too, because it is barriers that that are brought on, and it's just because of, like, you know, human variance. Like, it
Yeah.
definitely is a lot of accessibility can benefit people who may not even have a specific disability. One of the kind of questions I have is that I often kind of see that there is a bit of a misconception on accessibility in other areas of not beyond just gaming. Like, there's either digital or in like in real life, or even in TV and film, that a lot of people think that essentially just that you could just take the same accessibility and put that into games. But what is the difference between between those kind of like standards and practices for digital and for TV and film that can't easily translate into gaming?
That's a really good question. So the thing with gaming, I think there are some similarities that can sort of somewhat be inspired from other industries or replicated from other industries. There are some standards that we can definitely inspire ourselves from. However, the difference with gaming is that gaming is extremely interactive in highly creative worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And not no game is similar to one another.
Right.
There's genres of games,
Yep.
sure, but even within those genres, games are extremely different depending on what the developer's intended vision is. And we're, asking people to engage with those things. And also, we have different types of players that will engage with the game in different ways. And so we have different target audiences, that will engage with the title in different ways. And disabled people are part of those target audiences. They're not a separate audience.
Mm-hmm.
I like to always sort of double down on that. They're part of those different audiences, and we need to include them as well. The difference with, like, a film, for example, where we want to make a movie accessible or a TV show accessible, the level of interactivity from the actual user or the watcher in that sense is way more limited. You can sort of integrate accessibility, through captions, subtitles, audio description, and you basically put it in. You do it as you want it to be, look like, or sound like, and people just sit down and they just watch the thing or listen to the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to worry too much about how someone will sort of interact with
Yeah.
the experience, because it's just it's all pre-made, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense. But with gaming, there's a lot of elements that are interactable and that will be very different from one player station to the other. And so there's a lot of challenges there in terms of making sure that we're removing barriers without necessarily put people on rails and do everything for them. We want them to engage with the title. But sometimes perhaps the design that we've made are not accessible themselves, so we do need to add a certain level of assistance to help players actually be able to interact with the damn thing to begin with. And so it's way more of a can of worm, I feel, to think about accessibility in gaming. And I think it is more overwhelming for someone who starts out, thinking about this stuff and doesn't know where to start, because it is not as straightforward from A to Z as, for other types of medium that are a bit more linear, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I think it like I love that, because it's like, as you said, it's like every game is inherently different from another. I think that's kind of like always the main goal of any game developer, is to try to be able to make something that is different. Like, even when you're making a sequel to a game, you want to give a different variance of that same gameplay experience, because you want something. Every gamer wants something new and different in each game, even if a game is in a similar genre of something that they're used to. And as you said, like, with the amount of interactivity that there is in games inherently, it's a lot harder to be able to kind of like nail down exactly what that game would actually need as far as accessibility, and it becomes a lot more complex. And that's kind of leads me to I want to talk a little bit about the need for like accessibility services and even freelance consultants, kind of like how like player research comes in, because we see there's a bunch of like guidelines, and there's that are offered from from places like like Microsoft and game accessibility guidelines.com, and even player research even has that as well. But what are like because of how games are, how interactive that they are, could you be able to talk a little bit about like the difference between like say the two of like freelance consultants, and what actually like services like player research can provide game developers when making their games?
Yeah, so I think there's like a couple of different layers here, because I think nowadays we're starting to see more and more resources online, like you said, guidelines, or sometimes it's going to be talks, or articles, or like even research studies, things like that are around accessibility. But when you're starting to look into how do I make my game accessible, it can be extremely overwhelming to know where to start. And even if you have guidelines, not everything is applicable necessarily to your game, so you don't
Hmm.
necessarily know what applies to you. If you have a larger team, it can be also difficult to know who's responsible for what area of accessibility. You don't necessarily know, you don't know what you don't know, right? Like, so you
Hmm.
don't know the barriers that are already there, you don't know the ones that aren't there. And so it can be very overwhelming. And just like anything else, if you don't know what you're doing, either you're gonna sort of sweep it under the rug and kind of hope that no one cares, or you're just gonna perhaps do the wrong thing, and approach it in the wrong way with the best intentions, but maybe you're gonna do it wrong and either have more barriers than you initially started with, or replace barriers with other ones.
Hmm.
Um, so it can be very overwhelming, and that's something I think is really important too when we talk about empathy in gaming and the accessibility space. We often talk about empathy towards the player base, which I think is, of course, the number one thing that we talk about, to include our all audiences into gaming experiences as much as we can. But we also need to acknowledge needing to build empathy with dev teams
Hmm.
and studios who maybe are starting into this field and don't necessarily know where to start, and might have basic questions that some people think of as obvious but aren't necessarily obvious. And so that's when you'll have different needs, either for consultants to either give feedback to the dev team about certain experiences. Maybe they'll try a part of the game and give some feedback. Maybe they'll review some design docs, give some feedback, or maybe they'll participate into like expert reviews, or they'll do expert playtests, or like things like that with within studios with teams like that. Or sometimes they'll deliver talks, or they'll host events, things like that at different studios who don't necessarily have accessibility teams in-house.
Hmm.
And that's also where services like ours are needed, because a lot of studios, even if they do have the intention and the will to make their experiences more accessible, they don't necessarily have the internal resources to educate their teams,
Hmm.
to review all the designs at different stages, to plan accessibility and like integrate accessibility within the production roadmap, test for finding accessibility barriers, conducting research, reviewing marketing materials, things like that. There's a lot of different layers that, of course, comes into delivering a gaming experience to the public. And that entire loop has, it affects accessibility in at all the different stages. And so, having services like this really ensure that this is something that can be scaling up, when you're working on this mission, either for the first time or just want to augment your bandwidth in, dedicating more time and more resources to doing accessibility work. And even though nowadays we are starting to see, studios that have full-time accessibility specialists in-house, or managers or designers, the reality is that the vast majority of studios don't have that, and don't have
Hmm.
access to these teams internally or with their publisher. And so that's where we come in. We're a third party service, and anybody can reach out to us and hire us. And we have different types of services for different types of needs, for different stages of production. And so whether someone is still at the concept phase and just needs to establish accessibility goals, or integrate accessibility goals within their design intentions, or they want to do an accessibility audit to figure out, like, where are the low hanging fruits right now in our game, like what do we need to fix, things like that. we have something that will sort of meet that need for those different stages. And like we also work both with Keyword Studios, who's the company that actually Play Research is part of, and so we work with different teams within Keyword Studios who work in codev or work in accessibility for very specific needs. For example, Descriptive Video Works, who does audio description, we collaborate with them for different projects, or the QA teams we've trained to be able to conduct accessibility testing, and also we hire consultants on a need basis to help us with either consultancy events or trainings for clients and things like that. And so that was really important for me when we started this this new service, was having this space for, maybe we'll be a smaller internal team, but, we'll hire external freelance consultants to work with us on projects. So, yeah.
So, like, even going back to a little bit about your background, then it's like, so what, like, when you saw this sort of need that within the industry, like, what sort of led you from, leading accessibility within a game studio, like being that kind of that sole person within a studio and at a publisher, to like jumping into becoming a part of the, like, a service provider, like you would with Player Research? What was sort of that transition like for you?
So I think for me, the thing that sort of triggered me to move towards a position like the one I have right now is that working from within a studio and with a publisher, I needed that help and I couldn't find it.
Okay.
So I was sort of on the client side of things, if that makes sense. And
Sure.
I was like, I was struggling to find help. Of course, there's freelance consultants, but, we didn't have, a one-stop shop place that we could go to, be able to fill the gaps at different stages of production. And the thing too is that there's still, I will say, a certain level of education needed and experience needed for more freelance consultants to get development experience, because there's a lot of consultants that are amazing at giving feedback based on their experience with disability in gaming, but not necessarily having experience working in a studio with developers. And so, for me, that's something that I was really wanting to fill as a gap, because I had been working with development teams and production teams for years now. And I was like, I wish I could help other studios and other teams. So for me, it was important for me that I could find a professional venture that could allow me to, work with the people that I want, if that makes sense. So that, we were able to not limit ourselves to certain types of teams. Like when I used to work from a studio, my quote unquote clients were, I couldn't choose them. These were the people that worked internally with us, and that's it. And it's like, and so now there's kind of like a big shift in terms of how those relationships are with the teams that we work with, because they're either asking for our help or, we are there to educate them, and, they're hungry for knowledge, and, technically they're paying for it. And so, they want it. And so for being alone in a company, sometimes when you're like in studio, can be really challenging, because of course, like you're launching this new service and it's something that your studio is not necessarily very mature at yet. And it can feel really overwhelming to have to push for this work by yourself. It feels a little bit more rewarding now, I feel, to be able to deliver that work to more people and more teams, and also being able to have an impact with the community, where we're able to hire folks here and there to help us work with stuff to help clients make their experiences more accessible. So yeah.
I love that. And so you mentioned about like kind of like sharing that knowledge with people in the industry. So I mean, that's kind of essentially what this little podcast is about. So why don't you tell the folks who are listening or watching, like why is Player Research doing this podcast, and what are some of the comments from like our guests that we've got coming up for the show?
Yeah, so the podcast is really meant to, first of all, yes, continue to push for that advocacy work that never really stops when you're in this field. So continuing to spread awareness around why accessibility is important, but also have people understand that accessibility is not this one thing that you might have preconceptions about. So like for me, doing this podcast was a way to really connect with individuals that can really give you a bit of a snap view of like the different fields within accessibility even, and how those people help making games more accessible in different ways. There's different experts within accessibility. Not all accessibility consultants are generalists. There's consultants that focus on different things. There's people who have different types of experiences or that deliver different types of work. Like we have Grant Stoner, who's a guest, who's a journalist who focuses a lot on disability in gaming and accessibility. We have Jenna from Descriptive Video Works, who does audio description. We have Ross Miner, who is a consultant, content creator, and ex-Paralympic, who does a lot of advocacy work and speaking events and consulting, things like that. And we have Jessica from Ubisoft, who actually works in PR and marketing and actually is a huge pillar there in implementing accessibility best practices within the marketing cycle and the PR events and things like that. And so these are all different people that do different things to bring accessibility within the gaming industry in wildly different ways. And I think I want to give platform to those people to talk about what they do and also show people that, accessibility is not a one size fits all. There's different approaches, different needs that exist. And so, yeah, that's basically the purpose of this podcast is educating, having fun, getting to know individuals also who work in the space and connecting, people together to, build empathy together and find ways to be more collaborative and open to one another.
I love that. I can't wait to be able to sit down with these guests and get to learn a little bit more about them. So kind of diving in a little bit into sort of like what kind of like consultancy, like say like a player research would be able to do, or even just consultants even in general. What are some of the like accessibility barriers that a developer would have to kind of take a look at and try to be able to create accessibility for those barriers so that players can be able to play games?
Yeah, so there's different approaches because when it comes to making a game accessible, you can either make it accessible by design, by implementing accessibility into your design intentions by default, or you can also remove accessibility barriers by adding customization and features and options that players can actually use to make their experience more accessible independently. So in order to decide what's the best approach for everything, of course, it's really, really case by case, working with different developers to understand, okay, what is your vision just without thinking about accessibility yet, like what is your vision? What do you want people to experience when they're playing this game? What are you intending in terms of your 3Cs, which is the controls, character, camera, your movements? What's the gameplay loop? What are the different pillars of your game? Like, are there specific like unique selling points that in your game that you want to make sure that people pick up on? And then we'll work with the development team to have accessibility align with those objectives to have the most impact, if that makes sense. So for example, let's say that we have a game that the devs tell us, oh well, in this game one of the big important thing is combat, and we actually have combat that's vertical, and so people can fight in the sky, something like that. And it's like, oh, that's awesome, but then we can maybe already identify, ooh, maybe we'll have some potential barriers with controls here. Is there going to be a lot of simultaneous inputs? Are people going to need to hold something to stay in the air, like things like that? So being able to understand the vision of the creative team and the development team is going to be really helpful in defining accessibility goals. There's going to be some standards that we're going to see, like making sure that your game has subtitles for dialogue, closed captions for all the sound effects that are important for the comprehension of the game. There's going to be other stuff like making sure that you're having text that's readable, both in size and choosing the proper fonts, making sure that your game is colorblind friendly, either by default, by not relying on color for any information that you're trying to convey, or also allowing players to customize their color palette, for example. There's different approaches for different types of barriers, and that's where we want developers to feel free to reach out to us to really figure out accessibility solutions that will work for their experience, to make their game as consistent as possible for as many people as possible. That's something that Adarin Thompson said a couple of years back, and I keep reusing this phrase because I think it's a great way to put it. Like, the goal is not to create a completely different experience for the disability community. It's to create experiences that are consistent for as much of your target audience as possible, because disabled people and people with accessibility needs are part of those audiences. They're not a separate thing. And so, yes, there are some standards that you're going to sort of like see from game to game, but there's also going to be highly particular instances or scenarios that are going to be really just applicable to your game and your game only kind of thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we can't learn from each other. There's going to be stuff that's going to work for other people in different ways. But, that's where, we need to educate, yes, in accessibility in general, for people to understand why it's important, but why we also need to work directly with teams to, approach accessibility in the most efficient way, and also budget-friendly way for their team. We don't want people to spend, time and resources working on solutions that actually are not the best approach for their title. That's something we want to avoid. And so that's also where we can come and help and get people to focus on the right stuff, and also understand, like, okay, who's the owner of what on your team? Like, who are the accessibility champions on your team, but also who's not a champion, but that's ultimately gonna work on accessibility anyways, because not everyone is an accessibility champion, and that's something that we need to be cognizant of. Like, when we're establishing these goals, is like, people are gonna have different tasks as part of what's on their plate. If you're a sound designer, you're gonna work on a lot of different stuff that will ultimately affect accessibility. Doesn't mean that you're gonna be an accessibility champion, though. So we need to make sure that we're making accessibility as approachable and accessible as possible to those people.
I love that, because and often the discourse that kind of comes up online is that accessibility kind of ruins the vision of a game, and what I love about the work that the player research does, and then also even like consultants, but also just people in the accessibility community offer, is that it's not, as you said, it's not necessarily about forcing accessibility into your game. It's about seeing what vision you have for the game that you want to make, and basically expanding it out to like a much larger audience than before. Like, we want the game, if you have a game that that is about combat, and you said, like, even about like vertical combat, and it's like, it's about providing that same experience for a disabled player as much as you're providing the same experience for a non-disabled player. But even then, accessibility is kind of for everybody, and just the more accessibility that can be added to the game, it just enhances that vision even further and makes it even more playable for people. So that's where the approachability versus accessibility and all that kind of comes into play too. And so I'm glad that that these kind of resources exist, because I think as we both started in the industry, like at least on the accessibility side, like some of these kind of things didn't exist, and the knowledge about accessibility wasn't really as available, or even resources provided to studios weren't exactly as available as they once were. So I like seeing that. And actually, there was one kind of side question I wanted to ask, because obviously you said player research can be able to offer these services to studios. What do you say to those who are, like, say, for like the kind of the smaller studios, or like, because obviously AAA, they have, we're going to say, they have enough of resources or budget to be able to kind of like to incorporate player research into their development cycle. But what do you say to those are like the smaller teams, or like the indie teams, like who the common thing is, they may not have enough resources to help make their games more accessible. What do you tell to those folks?
Yeah, so there's two things. So one, we tried to make our services as flexible as possible in terms of the different types of services that we can offer at different like layers of budget, if that makes sense. So that's one thing. But if, for example, we have someone who's just like, hey, I'm a solo developer or I'm a really small team, what can I do to make my game more accessible? Usually I'll just forward either to different consultants that I can recommend or different guidelines that I can recommend. There's actually a lot of resources now, and even like online courses that you can access to deepen your accessibility knowledge. A lot of those courses are a little bit more towards the fundamentals, but that's still the place to start, right? Like, so that's one thing. There's also different resources now available for the different engines that exist, whether you're developing in Unity or in Unreal. There's a lot of resources now available, plugins that you can use to help yourself in terms of development, as well as in-engine tools that you can use to make your experience more accessible. And I'd like to sort of point out that a lot of the games that are being recognized as accessibility, like best in accessibility examples, do include indie games as well. Like we're seeing games that launched last year, like Stories of Blossom, or prior to that, Celeste or Chicory or things like that. These are small teams that developed these amazingly accessible games with quite small resources. And the really key thing for me, I think, to take from that is that when you integrate accessibility into your design intentions is where you can prevent from implementing barriers to begin with in your game, and so not needing to actually fix those barriers because you didn't put them in to begin with.
Right.
And so I think when teams have a more limited budget or just less amount of people working on the title, you usually are very resourceful in how you're gonna manage your work and your resources. And so accessibility is no exception. I feel like indies are extremely creative in problem solving and preventing the presence of barriers in their game, but it has to be a purpose that you have from as early as possible. So that's really the key, right? It's never too late to see what can be done, but if you're early, it's never too early to start thinking about it. So,
exactly. Yeah. Oh, I love that. All right. Well, unfortunately, our time is at an end for this first episode. But if there are those who are listening or watching who wanted to be able to get some more resources or just to find out more about what Player Research is doing and what you're doing as far as the advanced accessibility side, where can people go to be able to check that out?
So you can head to our website at playerresearch.com. We have a specific section about accessibility there. You can also find about other accessibility related services offered at Keywords if you go to the accessibility services page at keywordstudios.com. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn just using my full name, Améliane F. Chiasson, and I'm at the Slasher Chick on most socials as well. I'm not very active on socials these days, but you can follow me still if you want.
That's okay. I mean, we're all like, it's at a point where it's like, we were there, but we're like not of our own volition. Perfect.
Well, thank you, Steve.
No, thank you, Ame, for being here. I'm looking forward to this podcast and some of the guests we've got coming up. So make sure you stay tuned. And thank you so much for listening and watching. If you have any questions, you can either contact myself, Ame, or the folks at Player Research if you'd like to be able to learn more about what we talked about today and for the rest of the podcast. And, check out the rest of the series on advancing accessibility. Thanks again, and have a great day, and go play some games. Bye.
Thank you, Steve. Bye.